The position of metaphysical idealism claims that what appears to be the independently existing physical world is instead an appearance or construction constituted in consciousness. Consciousness, or the mental, has ontological priority over the physical. The existence of a consciousness-independent physical world is denied. This is physical anti-realism. While metaphysical idealism has been presented in various forms throughout the history of philosophy, in contemporary philosophy it has lived a rather withdrawn life. It has had its proponents, though, most notably perhaps Timothy Sprigg and John Foster, as there are quite strong arguments in favor of this position. And it is therefore worth looking into as a serious position on the nature of reality. In this video I will therefore look at these arguments, as well as counter-arguments, the case for metaphysical idealism. The two main topics of relevance here are the problem of perception and the question of physical realism versus anti-realism. In contemporary philosophy, epistemological idealism is not uncommon. The view that it is not possible to characterize the real in positive ways independent of our views and interpretations. Linguistic idealism, for example, claims that language in some sense creates our reality. As noted, metaphysical idealism, however, is the stronger claim that not only can we not explain reality independent of consciousness, but physical realism is rejected. The physical world does not possess consciousness-independent existence. On the contrary, it is constituted in consciousness. This position does not rule out the possibility that an external objective reality exists, but it does rule out the possibility that such a world is of a physical nature. So while physical realism is rejected, other weaker forms of realism are acceptable. On such a view, external reality, to the extent that it exists, must be directly linked to consciousness, to be mind-like, as it were, in the sense that it is an experiential reality, that there is a way it is to be this reality. These are the core conditions accepted by the idealist tradition. There seem to be two main lines of argument for metaphysical idealism. One starts from the explanatory shortcomings of the other main metaphysical positions, not least the very significant problem of consciousness, and attempts to address the problems idealism faces, arguing that they are less severe than the problems facing the other positions, and thus idealism provides a better option than its rivals. I've followed that line of argument somewhat in a previous video, so in this video I present the second line of argument. Here, metaphysical idealism is argued for in a more direct way through the problem of perception. There are three main positions regarding the question of how perception relates to reality: direct realism, indirect or representative realism, and phenomenalism. Phenomenalism, roughly subjective idealism, holds that sense data are consciousness-created entities unrelated to any consciousness-independent, perhaps physical, objects. Phenomenalism is the least advocated of the three main positions in contemporary philosophy. And this is probably not without reason. Typical objections often point to the subjective aspect of this type of idealism and its contravention of common sense. An even more important objection notes that an objective external underpinning for how things are disposed to appear is necessary to avoid solipsism. A willing, creating deity has been proposed as providing this underpinning, but in this video we won't engage with the theistic position. So the phenomenalist position clearly faces significant challenges. According to the position of direct realism, we have direct perceptual access to the physical world. What we experience is the external world as it is, or roughly as it is. A common objection to this position is that phenomena such as illusions and hallucinations undermine the belief that perception gives us direct access to external objects, with these being independent of consciousness. Also, as modern science has uncovered, objects are not simply as they are concretely perceived, but consist of smaller physical systems or parts. Although this is only an objection against naive realism, the claim that the world is exactly as it appears, rather than against scientific realism, which holds that science describes the actual world and is not merely a construct. Most difficult, though, is the question of how consciousness reaches the external physical object. How do we get beyond our experience of the thing and out to the thing itself? One version of this argument against direct realism claims that it is impossible to genuinely imagine a physical event or thing that can exist apart from awareness of it, because, quote, you always imagine it in possession of properties which it could only have for a conscious subject, end quote. Quote, thus, if we say that the physical world does exist apart from consciousness, we do not really know what we are talking about, at least not in the way that a metaphysician should expect to know what he's talking about, end quote. Direct realism claims that physical objects themselves feature immediately in our conscious experience, in a substantive phenomenal sense. This seems to imply, however, that physical objects are fundamentally mind-dependent. That is, that direct realism is actually fundamentally idealistic when it comes down to it. The view that we have direct perceptual access to the object is hit hard by the illusion and hallucination arguments. One attempt to solve this problem is the disjunctive theory of perception. While other positions accept a premise that the real and the illusory or hallucinatory experiences must have something in common, this view rejects that. These experiences might appear similar, but they are in fact different, since it is argued the former is the actual world that is experienced, since it is partly constitutive of the current mental state, while this is not the case with the latter. The perceptual states are thus separated disjunctively, so that when an object is seen, it is either the case that the object is actually present and perceived, or it only appears as if the object is present and perceived. A significant objection against this point of view, though, is that it is then apparently not possible for the experiencer to introspectively say which of the two mental states is in play at any given moment. A related criticism imagines a case in which an object is genuinely perceived, but during this perception it is removed, and at the same time the brain is stimulated to remain in the state it would have been if the object had continued to be present. This will mean a changed mental state, even though the brain state was completely unchanged, which contradicts the common assumption that consciousness supervenes on the neural system. According to the intentionalist theory of perception, perceptive mental states do have the property of representing particular aspects of the world. But while perceptual experience in this view is representational, it is not relational, and the action-object relationship is rejected. That is, it is a non-relational representation of ordinary objects. The illusion argument is handled by referring to the fact that one can very well have false beliefs, and representational states can thus be erroneous without this implying that there is no shared intentional content. In the case of true perception, the content is a representation of the world, while in the case of illusion or hallucination, it is not. A main objection to the intentionalist view, however, is that it does not sufficiently separate the perception experience from other types of intentionality. Thus, the peculiarity of perception is not captured, that is, the qualitative character or feeling of the perceptual experience. The debate between naive realists and disjunctivists versus intentionalists has thus been characterized as, quote, the greatest chasm in the philosophy of perception, end quote. And the debate on the problem of perception is thus still very much open. A number of objections have been advanced against the indirect realist views. In the adverbial theory, perception is understood as explained through adverbs that describe the verbs of perception. I do not see a green object, but my perception is modified in the special way that can be described as that I see greenly. I see in a green way, and indirect realism is thus rejected. Important objections to this theory note that these adverbial descriptions are not unambiguous when it comes to combining the adverbs in the right way when several things are sensed at the same time. And that since experience is not seen as consisting of representations, it is not explained why we have the experience of directly accessible consciousness-independent objects that we have. A significant objection to the representational realistic position is that sensory data, sometimes called the veil of perception, which in a representational view of perception is present between consciousness and the external world, means that our access to the world is prevented. It opens space for radical skepticism, thereby potentially making epistemic access to the world impossible. One counter-argument to this objection is that sense data is merely the medium through which we perceive the real consciousness-independent world. And, as it is phrased, we, quote, no more creates a veil of perception than the fact that we use words to talk about things creates a veil of words between us and the things we talk about, end quote. In general, the arguments about the obscuring of the external world must thus be seen as significant, but facing counter-arguments. In addition, the fundamental perceptive inaccessibility of external reality need not to be seen as something that must be countered, but may instead be a significant point in favor of the view. Another objection concerns the apparent incompatibility with a naturalistic view. However, here it is important to consider which form of naturalism is taken as framework. If it is reductionist naturalism, grounded in the physicalist view, this problem is clearly present. In a broader conception of naturalism, which can embrace, for example, metaphysical idealism, this incompatibility is not present. I have advocated such a broader variant of naturalism in another video. Okay, summary. The problem of perception plays, and this is quite to be expected, a decisive role regarding the foundation of metaphysical idealism. None of the main positions of direct realism stands sufficiently strong to adequately support rejecting the other positions. On the contrary, the problem of how to bridge the gap between the externally existing thing and our experience of it seems to cause direct realism major problems, and no satisfactory solutions are presented. Phenomenalism faces its own difficulties though, not least the problem of lack of an objective support. Representative realism, on the other hand, seems more difficult to refute. And it stands perhaps even stronger than the direct realist positions if physical realism is not assumed. While the philosophical debate today is primarily oriented towards realism versus anti-realism rather than realism versus idealism, there is nevertheless a great deal of overlap, and the realism versus anti-realism question is therefore relevant when it comes to the question of metaphysical idealism. Realism regarding the external physical world, physical realism, has been formulated as the view that, quote, the physical world exists and has its fundamental properties independently of the way it is experienced, conceived, spoken, or written about, or coped with by conscious beings, end quote. While this position of realism can be contested from a linguistic idealist angle, the focus in this video is instead a metaphysical angle. On the assumption that representational realism is true, one might object against physical realism that external reality is arranged in a way that does not correspond one-to-one to the representation of it, to our experience of it. We have no way at all to determine whether this is the case. Any statement about external reality faces the verification problem. How do we verify the statement given that we only have access to representations of external reality, not external reality itself? And even if external reality were to correspond completely to the physical world that we experience, we still cannot equate the two, it has been argued. They are not identical, not least as the latter has an experience constitutive aspect which the former does not. That is, even in this best case scenario for physicalism, where external reality and what we experience as the physical world correspond completely, physical realism cannot be adequately justified. Thus, the physical realist position can certainly be criticized on the basis of skepticism, but more than that, the skeptical view can be enhanced by asserting that the physical realist position does not leave room for such a principled uncertainty, since the physical world, in order for it to be what we mean by the physical world, must be empirically immanent. It must possess a direct nearness to us, be a world for us, as it has been phrased. Physical realism is a position that is about the metaphysical nature of the physical world, and not about what we can most plausibly say about this nature, it is argued. However, if the claim of physical realism asserted epistemically is less strong, it also avoids this objection somewhat. If it is acknowledged that physical realism cannot be conclusively justified through a rejection of physical anti-realism accomplished solely by a priori arguments, not least because of the fundamental problem of verification, one must instead resort to a posteriori argument. Defense of physical realism in contemporary philosophy thus include a more empirically oriented approach, where the aim is not to show that physical realism is necessarily true, but instead to show that it is likely true, through reference to its greater explanatory power, simplicity, and so on. Physical realism then becomes merely a question of plausibility. Further, physical realism stands stronger than anti-realism, it is argued, since physical realism seems to be the most natural conclusion to draw. If things do appear realistically, then why not take it at face value? Why not assume that those things and states of affairs which appear to be real and which we understand as such are really real? It is plausible that a physical object that causes the experience of such an object actually exists. It is precisely an apple that causes the appearance to me of an apple, it is argued. That is, physical anti-realism has a greater burden of proofs than physical realism, so to speak. So, the realist point of view has been supported through empirically based arguments. despite the problem of perception. At least to some extent, these arguments seem to rest on the assumption of a materialist-naturalist framework. However, there are rather strong arguments for questioning this assumption. I have advocated such questioning in other videos. They include that the naturalist or physicalist metaphysics cannot justify itself. It is precisely a metaphysical premise or assumption, and there are thus no compelling reasons to choose that metaphysics over another. That it is often done anyway can be seen as an expression of the spirit of the times, rather than as a sign of physicalism being more substantiated than other possible metaphysical positions. And not least, nothing in the physical world has been found that explains the existence of consciousness. The metaphysical premise of physicalism or metaphysical materialism must therefore be judged to be less well-founded than is often assumed. It is merely a premise. Another argument against physical realism, especially physicalism, is that we only have access to neutral or quantitative knowledge of the external physical world, assuming it exists, while the intrinsic or qualitative aspects of it are inaccessible to us. The only knowledge we can obtain about the world, both through ordinary perception and through science, is about structural conditions, which means that the qualitative elements, which are fundamentally present in our world of experience, cannot be explained. Metaphorically, like a man born blind, he can know what spheres and cubes are to touch, and he can know the basic structural or formal facts about them, but he cannot know what the forms look like. This is not a problem from an ontological structuralist realist point of view, that only the structural or, loosely speaking, mathematical content of a scientific theory is committing, and the only thing that exists are these structures. However, a number of counter-arguments have been advanced against this point of view, including that it is not sufficiently developed as an alternative to traditional metaphysics, that causality is not adequately explained, that structural realism is less obvious when it comes to sciences other than the mathematically oriented ones, such as physics, that the difference between the mathematically abstract and the physically concrete cannot itself be explained in a purely structural description, that it is debatable whether it is a genuine form of realism, and more. Thus, there are powerful arguments against the structuralist realist position. So, although physical anti-realism conflicts heavily with common sense, there are rather strong arguments against physical realism. A weaker form of realism within the framework of representative realism is another option, though, and it avoids a number of those objections. In contrast to phenomenalism, it could be argued that our experiences must have a cause outside of ourselves, some kind of non-physical, trans-empirical reality with the causal properties and the structure we ordinarily ascribe to the physical world. There must be something that causes us to have the experience of a consistent physical world, something that provides the objective underpinning of this experience. This combination of representative perception and external realism, but not physical realism, a metaphysical idealistic view, would avoid many of the objections mentioned. Also, the empirical fact that changes in brain states seem to cause changes in mental states, that consciousness supervenes on the neural system, poses a specific, seemingly rather strong argument against idealism, since the causal relation is here claimed to be the opposite, that the mental is more fundamental than the physical. However, under a premise of representative perception and external but non-physical realism, it is not a matter of a change in a brain state causing a change in a mental state, but instead that the seemingly physical brain is itself an appearance of a part of the underlying external reality. As this external reality, and not the appearance of it, possesses the actual causal properties, a causal relation between brain activity and mental states is consistent with this view. Only is it not a causal relation between a physical brain and mental states, but a causal relation within the transempirical external reality. Variants of absolute idealism have been advocated, combining representative perception and non-physical external realism, and they look promising. I've touched upon that subject already in a previous video, and I will cover Spriggs' absolute idealistic metaphysics specifically in a later video. Okay, to conclude, both phenomenalism and direct realism are confronted with powerful counter-arguments, and while representative or indirect realism faces its own counter-arguments, it at least arguably stands stronger. While this position is compatible with physical realism, substantial arguments do speak against physical realism. Most notably that there is, at least at the present, no adequate solution to the most crucial problem for a physical realist view, the problem of representation. It has been noted that, quote, anti-realism gains much of its force by highlighting a gap between realist metaphysics and epistemology that no one really knows how to bridge. End quote. This paves the way for phenomenalism, roughly subjective idealism, as well as absolute idealism, with the latter looking perhaps most promising. And that is, the door is open for metaphysical idealism. As one philosopher has noted, quote, deviations from direct realism have a tendency to become uncontrollable. One gives idealism a little finger and apparently has to accept that it takes the whole hand. End quote. Thanks.